The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello, welcome back to a brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. And as you may have guessed from the title of this week's installment of the show, we are in for a particularly odd tale today. Since I first launched the podcast back in 2022, I think I've been asked to cover this strange story at least once a month, despite it taking place over 500 years ago. So here we go. This is the truly bizarre tale of the event known as the Dancing Plague of 1518. I'm going to be diving into all aspects of this case, including the theories as to why it might have happened, and I may or may not have an extra theory of my own to throw into the mix too. Let's get started. Our story today takes place in the city of Strasbourg, a place we now know as being in France, but which was in 1518 a free imperial city in the Holy Roman Empire. Located in the region of Alsace, right on the border with Germany, the area is known for having a blend of French and German influences. It was mid-July, and the summer heat was particularly intense, sweltering even. Yet instead of seeking shade and trying to keep cool, one local woman named as Frau Troffea took a decidedly different approach. On a day that would mark the beginning of a very unusual period in the city's history, stepping into one of Strasbourg's cobbled streets, she began to dance. There was no music being played, no festivals or parties taking place, and no one else around her was doing anything of the sort, at least not yet. Frau Troffea's husband and neighbours were all, understandably, quite baffled by her actions, and the longer her spontaneous dancing went on for, the more voices piped up urging her to stop or at least take a break. But they were all ignored. By the time that night fell, some sources state that she collapsed due to sheer exhaustion. However, when the sun rose the next morning, she was revived, and though her feet were swollen and she was probably incredibly thirsty and hungry, she began to dance once again. By the third day, people had started to gather round to observe what she was doing, completely fixated on this strange spectacle. And as the news about her dancing continued to spread, so did the level of concern. Whether it was true concern for her or concern about how her behaviour was affecting the public, we don't know. But after dancing for just shy of a week, Frau Troffea was picked up by the authorities and taken to the commune of Saverne, around 30 miles away. We'll get on to why this could have been a little bit later, but for now, let's stay in Strasbourg, because although Frau Troffea was gone, the dancing had not stopped. Seemingly inspired by her actions, several other people had now joined in with this persistent display of movement, dancing in this kind of wild, twitching, flailing manner. Don't get me wrong, this was not some kind of beautiful, choreographed recital. By all accounts, it was quite primal, even frantic, and the motions looked more like convulsions than anything more fluid and artful. After about a week, the crowd of dancers had grown to around 30, and by August, well, it had all become pretty out of control. It's said that as many as 400 people were now locked into this almost trance-like performance, not in the sense that their movements were slow, but that they just simply didn't or couldn't seem to stop. Before long, whether it was due to exhaustion, dehydration, hunger, exposure to the sweltering heat, or more likely a combination of all four, many of the dancers started to collapse and were then also taken to Saverne. But if the reports are to be believed, a disturbing number of those involved actually ended up passing away, having literally danced themselves to death. Now, the authorities, including religious officials in Strasbourg, were understandably perplexed, and after gathering to try and work out what their response to this quote-unquote dancing mania should be, they came up with a somewhat risky idea. They theorized that the best course of action was to allow the group to continue and to actually make it even easier for them to do so by designating certain guild halls as these sort of official spaces for those affected by this compulsion to move into and carry on dancing. It's also said that they built wooden stages in very public areas and even started to provide music too. And whilst this all sounds completely counterproductive, it's thought that they arrived at this plan for one of two reasons. Either that they assumed the dancers would eventually tire themselves out, so by accommodating them they'd help to speed this process up, or that they believed those dancing were afflicted with some kind of sickness and were engaging in this relentless movement in order to try and rid themselves of whatever was harming them. However, it quickly became obvious that this strategy was absolutely not working, as the number of people seemingly under the spell of this dancing plague continued to grow throughout August. These decisions were ultimately reversed, and the dedicated dancing spaces were closed down. By early September, things did begin to settle though, before finally coming to an end as the month went on. But think about it, that's still the best part of 2 months at the height of summer that were entirely taken over by this bizarre phenomenon that ended up claiming the lives of a good number of those affected, if certain accounts are to be believed. But it gets stranger, because whilst the dancing plague of 1518 in Strasbourg is probably the most well documented and also one of the last cases of its kind, it certainly wasn't the first. Historians believe that between the 10th and the 16th centuries, there were several other incredibly similar incidents that took place within Europe, sometimes involving smaller groups of people and on other occasions hundreds, and one of the most notable years for these events was 1374, starting in the German city of Aachen and then spreading throughout various towns that lined the River Rhine. Dozens of residents at a time were being swept up by this uncontrollable need to dance, and the descriptions of the movements match up with those we'd hear about almost 150 years later in Strasbourg. The poor people who were drawn towards joining in were often said to look almost possessed, moving with these really awkward and jarring motions. Again, these outbreaks of the so-called dancing mania in 1374 are thought to have lasted for a few weeks before gradually petering out. Interestingly, and perhaps just as bizarrely, shortly before the events of 1518, there was something slightly different yet equally fascinating that occurred at a nunnery in the Netherlands. In 1491, several nuns living in close quarters all began to exhibit the same unusual behavior, which mainly involved them starting to imitate different animals. They would claw at tree trunks like cats, or even climb the trees and try to jump out, flapping their arms as though they were birds. As I say, the nuns weren't dancing as such, but the principle was the same. A significant number of people who all lived in the same place, all becoming compelled to move or act in a way that was both very out of place and ultimately very detrimental to them. So, what on earth was going on? Why did so many people feel compelled to take part in this wild dancing ritual? Something they surely wouldn't have actively chosen to do. So, why did it happen? Well, one of the reasons why the 1518 case is so fascinating is because we have a surprising number of accounts written at or near to the time, so we can see the evolution of the different theories about what happened in Strasbourg, and possibly even apply these to the cases that took place elsewhere too. So let's begin by exploring some of the theories presented back in 1518, and also in the decades that came directly afterwards. Now, considering considering that this was the 16th century, it probably won't be too surprising to hear that one of the leading contemporary ideas, backed by the clergy to a certain extent, was that those afflicted by the dancing plague were either possessed or cursed, or were suffering from what they described as mania after somehow angering Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers. Remember I said that the very first Strasbourg dancer, Frau Troffea, was taken away to Saverne after a number of days? Well, this is because near to Saverne there's this amazing shrine to Saint Vitus within a cave, and the story goes that she was transported there and cured at the shrine. When word of this reached Strasbourg, Sebastian Brandt, the secretary of the city's council, wrote a report that detailed how many more of the dancers were then taken to the shrine and were given, quote, small crosses and red shoes, on the uppers and soles of which crosses had been drawn with consecrated oil, and which had been sprinkled with holy water in the name of Saint Vitus. Sebastian Brandt is an interesting character in this tale, actually. Around 2 decades before the dancing plague took hold of some of those in his city, he had written a satirical work entitled The Ship of Fools, and one of the lines from this book reads, "Dance and sin are one in kind," and implied that dancing in a merry fashion was the devil's work in action. Obviously, due to the satirical nature of the work, it's hard to know whether Brandt really held these views or not, but it wouldn't be particularly shocking if he did. However, there was also another theory that was widely discussed at the time, and this one was favoured by physicians and others who leaned more towards the medical explanations rather than the spiritual ones. You know how I mentioned that the authorities in Strasbourg decided to encourage the dancers to keep going, as they suspected they may be suffering from a sickness that needed to be, for lack of a better term, danced out of them? Well, the sickness in question was what they believed to be overheated blood on the brain. For a really significant period of time in history, I'm talking from ancient Greece all the way up until at least the 17th century and sometimes beyond, something called the humoral theory was widely accepted in the medical world. In the most basic terms, doctors believed that our bodies were made up of 4 humors. This is where it all gets a bit gross, but they were blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Why is phlegm the worst of those? Ugh. Anyway, if these elements became unbalanced, it was believed that this could cause all kinds of problems, including strange behaviour. In a fascinating academic paper written about the dancing plague, Lynette J. Miller explained this in relation to the event, saying, "Under these medical systems, continuous dancing could be caused by overheated and burned blood, or by an excess of blood, and could be cured through either cooling the blood or through sweating out the residue left by the burned blood. 2 of these 3 causes, burned blood and excess blood, were treated through more dancing. Only rest would cool the blood and treat the 3rd cause. Early modern medical theory held that most continuous dancing would eventually be cured if the dancers danced vigorously and lengthily enough." This is actually quite a compelling explanation in terms of helping to answer the question of why the people may have kept dancing for so long, as they were acting on medical advice, even though we know with our modern knowledge that this medical advice was incorrect. I assume that the reasons the physicians thought that people had this overheated blood was because it was summer and it was so hot. But overall, I think this theory is most interesting when we're looking at why the dancing went on for so long. One of the ideas that looks more closely at why the dancers may have started to dance in the first place was presented around 12 years after the dancing plague by the Renaissance physician and renowned misogynist Paracelsus, was that Frau Troffea had initially started dancing in order to annoy her husband, and then other local women had joined in order to annoy their husbands. Honestly though, this sounds to me like the most ridiculous theory we've heard thus far, far. I mean, truly, who would have the time or the energy for that? Anyway, whilst these were considered some of the most intriguing reasonings both at the time and for the centuries that followed, the bizarre events of these dancing plague outbreaks were not destined to be filed away and forgotten about. As our understanding of both physical and mental health conditions changed and evolved, so too did the suggestions being offered up as to just what could have taken place back in 1518. So let's now take a look at some of the more modern interpretations of why this dancing fever could have taken hold. One theory, discussed by several historians during the 20th century, was that there could have been a nature-related culprit, in the form of a species of fungus that grows on damp rye, called ergot. If humans consume this fungus, it can result in a very serious condition called ergotism. It's a really nasty form of food poisoning that produces horrible symptoms, including convulsions and hallucinations, amongst other severe gastrointestinal issues. It sounds absolutely horrendous. The more I read about it, the less I wanted to know. The idea was that if rye affected by ergot was used to make bread that was then eaten by the people in an area, perhaps it could have been the cause of the dancing mania. On the surface, this does sound like an intriguing theory. Maybe a mass form of food poisoning had caused a similar hallucination within the people of Strasbourg, leading them to feel this unstoppable compulsion to dance, even though their rational brains wanted them to stop. But in more recent times, this theory has been largely disputed. For example, in 2009, the historian John Waller explained in his book, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, that although ergotism can cause hallucinations and convulsions, that it also has a number of contradictory symptoms too. A patient with the condition would experience restricted blood flow to their hands and feet, making dancing for a prolonged period of time impossible. Plus, this theory would also not help to explain many of the previous instances of dancing plague that occurred in regions that didn't typically grow rye crops. It's also been pointed out that the 1518 incident in particular famously occurred during a very hot, sunny period of time when the crops wouldn't have been wet and therefore would have been unlikely to have been harboring this dangerous fungus. And so, with this idea largely thrown into doubt, the door was opened for new theories to be presented. And here we arrive at the point I'm sure many of you have been expecting me to touch on from the word go today. The possibility that the dancing plague could have been an instance of something we've discussed previously on the podcast, all the way back in episode 3 about the Hollingwell incident, the concept of what used to be known as mass hysteria. To use its proper name, mass psychological illness is a fascinating phenomenon that can show up in various different forms, affecting a number of people in the same ways at the same time. Though the term hysteria is quite antiquated and not widely accepted anymore, for some reason many sources do still use it when explaining that this phenomenon has two different branches, if you will: mass anxiety hysteria and mass motor hysteria. And it's obviously the latter of these that we're talking about today. One of the recognized subtypes of this second form of mass psychological illness is in fact choreomania, the act of dancing incessantly, unable to stop until your body stops for you, possibly permanently in the most extreme circumstances. This is the idea that most modern theorists have landed on to explain what took place in Strasbourg, and in some of those other cases I referred to earlier as well. But what could have caused this choreomania to take hold? Even though many experts now share the belief that mass psychological illness was likely the cause, there's still a lot of debate as to what could have prompted it. One idea links back to something I noted earlier: the cultural prominence of Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancing, within areas like Strasbourg at the time. There was a belief that Saint Vitus had the spiritual power to make sinners as dance as a form of punishment, and with local writers like Sebastian Brandt making such a point of trying to convince everyone that dancing was a sin in itself, it's possible that this could have had a profound effect on the very religious residents of the city, triggering this enormous stress response that seemed to spread. This could also explain why many of the places affected by these dancing plagues over the years had all been positioned near to the River Rhine. Word of mouth was incredibly powerful, and people who used the rivers to travel around, like merchants and pilgrims, could very well have been responsible for sharing these ideas throughout these towns and cities. It's been noted by John Waller that the conditions for the spread of this kind of mass psychological illness were just right too. Because most of the residents were so devoutly religious, this would mean their level of suggestibility to the idea of something like being cursed by a saint would likely be higher. Combine this with the fact that the dancing was so public, attracting crowds in the streets, and then being exacerbated by the authorities literally building stages for the dancers. It's no surprise that if people believed that one person in their community could be cursed, then maybe they could be next. Everyone would have some kind of sin that would put them on St. Vitus's hit list, right? This kind of ties into my own theory about what could have set off this episode of mass psychological illness in Strasbourg. My history geek side is about to come out here, so apologies for that. But as soon as I heard about this case, my first thought was around whether it could have been related to an event that took place just the previous year, across the border in Germany, in Wittenberg to be precise. In a nutshell, this is the town where, in 1517, Martin Luther is said to have nailed a document known as the 95 Theses to a church door. And although there's a lot of debate about whether this exact action did happen, the document was very real, and many historians view this as being a key moment that marked the start of the European Reformation. Essentially, Luther was challenging many of the accepted ways in which the Catholic Church functioned, and thanks to the advent of the printing press, his ideas were able to spread relatively quickly throughout Europe. By the next year, 1518, his words had been translated from Latin into German, and due to Strasbourg's location, it's likely that his pamphlets would have been accessible to some of the literate population within the city. Could this exposure to these challenges about their religious practices have been so deeply unsettling and stressful that it triggered this incident of mass psychological illness? I admit that there's no direct evidence to suggest this, but bearing in mind that this was one of the biggest religious changes to ever take place in Europe, I think it's worth considering, perhaps even just as one factor which sat alongside several others. We now know that stress is thought to play a big part in many recorded instances of mass psychological illness, especially in cases that are motor or movement based. And alongside ongoing religious unease, there were so many other reasons why this period in history was pretty stressful for those living through it. According to John Waller, not only had the people of Strasbourg experienced famine in the decade prior to the dancing plague outbreak, causing the price of things like bread to reach all-time highs, but they had also been dealing with all kinds of awful sickness outbreaks too. Leprosy and literal plague were a constant threat. And in case all of that wasn't terrible enough, syphilis had also begun to spread throughout the city. So, all things considered, I doubt that many of those who ended up within this group of dancers were having a particularly relaxing life before the summer of 1518. Interestingly, it seems that there could be a bit of a pattern here when it comes to the previous episodes of dancing plague noted throughout history. If you were to map out where the 1374 outbreak outbreaks I mentioned earlier took place, you'd see that there was a huge correlation between those affected towns and some incredibly severe flooding events. As I say, most of these places were situated along the River Rhine, and earlier on in that very same year, many of them had been hit by floods that had completely destroyed homes and livelihoods. According to chronicles from the time, these were among the worst floods of the entire century. So if we're looking for factors which could have caused a large number of people an enormous amount of stress, I think something like a devastating flood would more than qualify. I found a really fascinating article from the British Psychological Society, which actually backed up this idea, explaining that what they describe as mass motor hysteria, quote, typically requires a prolonged build-up of psychological tension, which then manifests itself in dissociative states, conversion symptoms, and other psychomotor abnormalities. These can persist for weeks or months. You could definitely argue that some of those living in places like France or Germany or the Netherlands around the times of these dancing plague incidents would probably have experienced their fair share of trauma, be it in the form of illness, devastating weather events, or religious turmoil, which would likely have resulted in this build-up of tension amongst communities. But to flip this point on its head, this idea leads us to the final theory I wanted to mention today. What if this dancing mania was not a form of mass psychological illness at all, but instead some kind of mass protest or demonstration? I think this idea could work on a few levels. What if Frau Troffea simply had a somewhat unorthodox response to life under all of the distressing circumstances we've just explored, and decided that there was nothing left for her to do but start dancing? I didn't mean for that to sound quite as much like a Jamiroquai lyric as it did, sorry about that, but you get my point. Maybe this physical display of freedom in the face of such hardship was infectious and prompted so many others to join in. Or maybe it wasn't a rebellion, but some kind of religious expression, a way to show their devotion to their patron saint of dance. Or perhaps they were all locked into a shared religious experience of some kind, like an extreme form of worship. These are all ideas that have been suggested at various points throughout history, although they're impossible to prove, as far as we know, no reasonings for their actions were ever given by any of those who survived the experience, which, in my opinion, tells us that this most likely wasn't an active choice they made, and points strongly towards the most rational explanation, that it really was an episode of mass psychological illness. But, like many cases that have similarities to this one, the dancing plague of 1518 is still generally considered to be somewhat mysterious. Whilst mass psychological illness does make the most sense to me, the fact is that we'll never be able to prove it beyond all doubt, due to the centuries that have passed since this bizarre turn of events. Although, as far as we know, this was the last dancing-specific example of the phenomenon reported in Europe, that's not to say that other related incidents haven't taken place since. During the 20th century, there were actually multiple reports of mass laughing outbreaks at numerous schools, many of which occurred within countries in Africa. As I'm sure we all know, schools can be very stressful places, especially around exam season, for example, and in certain situations, these uncontrollable episodes of laughter amongst students grew so large and so severe that the schools had to be temporarily closed. Do rest assured, though, that these matters are very rare, and I, for one, would like to believe that if something akin to the events of 1518 took place now, that there would be proper care available for those affected before any further harm was done. Well, I honestly feel kind of exhausted after even speaking about this strange moment in history for the past half an hour. I cannot even imagine what it must have been like for those affected by it for real. What do you think about this one? Do you reckon that the mass psychological illness explanation is the most obvious answer here? Or do you think that something more spiritual or even supernatural was at play? Were the dancers possessed? Or could it be possible that they were performing some kind of ritual? With these historical cases, I always think it's especially interesting to discuss all of the different theories. If you're listening on Spotify, please feel free to leave us a comment right here on the episode page and share your takes. There'll also be a poll to vote into, which is always a really fun way to get involved. I'm very much looking forward to hearing all about your thoughts on this one. But before we get to all of that, it's time for our outro feature, and I'm really excited for this one. So join me as we head on over to Weird Media. I have the most perfect weird media recommendation for you today. As soon as I started watching this series last week and ended up finishing it within the space of 2 days, I knew I was going to be giving it a shout out on the podcast. I'm talking about Small Profits, the new BBC 6-parter created by the amazing Mackenzie Crook. Like many people, I've been a fan of Mackenzie since The Office, and his show Detectorist is a big favourite of mine too. So when I heard that he was writing, directing, and taking a role in a new project, I was super excited, and it exceeded every expectation I had. Small Profits is set in Manchester, so from the word go, I felt very much at home watching it, and stars the brilliant Piers Quigley in the lead role of Michael. The BBC's description of the series sums it up so perfectly in saying that it's all about a meeting between the mundane and the magical, when the lonely and somewhat stuck-in-time character of Michael is introduced to something completely extraordinary by his elderly dad, played by the wonderful Michael Palin. I don't want to give away what this thing is, but it is something otherworldly, and the way that this extraordinary situation unfolds in the most ordinary suburban setting is something really special. If you love all things weird and wonderful, which I assume you do if you're here with me on the podcast today, I think you will love Small Profits. And if you're also a fellow Detectorist fan, I think you'll absolutely adore it. It definitely has some echoes of the style of that show, from the pace at times to things like the music. It's very Mackenzie Crook, and I think that's a very good thing indeed. The show definitely ends on a bit of a cliffhanger, possibly multiple cliffhangers, and whilst I don't believe a second series has been confirmed, I am very hopeful that it will be. So if you're looking for a new TV series to get stuck into, Small Profits is a truly excellent choice. Thank you all once again for being here today. I hope you found this episode as interesting as I did. In the show notes or description box, I'll be including shout-outs and links to the sources I used during my research, so feel free to check those out if you'd like to do some further reading. I'll also be listing all of our social media pages and our email address too. As I say, please do leave us a comment if you're listening on Spotify, or get in touch on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, or TikTok, and let me know which of the theories you found most compelling. If you have a moment or two, a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts is always hugely appreciated. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you once again for joining me today, and I'll be back next week with a brand new strange but true tale to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.